the second video in our module dealing with race and ethnicity, and again I would like all of you to be reading chapter 7 in the textbook. Let's begin with our learning objectives. There are two. The first thing that we're going to explore is we're going to put out a scientific definition of race as well as a scientific definition of ethnicity. The second thing that we will do is we're going to make the argument that race is primarily a socially constructed phenomena, meaning that it's not really rooted in biological reality. Rather, it's something that is a reflection of our culture. It's a little bit more in our minds than it is a biological fact. And what we will do is I will provide 5 pieces of evidence to suggest that this is the case. So let's begin by looking at our scientific definition of both race and also ethnicity. We'll begin with race. So I'm going to give you the definition, and it's quite long, but we'll go through it carefully. What race really represents is exceptionally small variations in the human genetic code. These extremely small variations have resulted from long periods of a group being isolated from other humans. Now, what you need to keep in the back of your mind is that over the course of about the last 15 years, we've basically been studying the human genome. We know a lot more about genetics today than we did even just 20 years ago. And from all of this new information and knowledge that has come in, we can now speak pretty confidently about this whole idea of race being primarily a socially produced phenomena. Let me give you an example. We now know, for example, that there's actually more genetic variation within the racial groups than between them. And so these really tiny variations that account for, let's say, variations in skin pigmentation or eye shape are basically meaningless, especially if you're looking at the big picture in terms of the entire human genome. Now, there's another element of our definition that we need to talk about. These really small, exceptionally small variations, almost all of them have resulted from adaptations to unique physical environments. And the way that you might want to think about this is through a variety of examples that I could give. I want to start out with just one. Let's talk about skin pigmentation. Why do some humans have relatively light skin pigmentation, and why do others have relatively dark skin pigmentation? Why does that vary? Well, it's thought. We're not 100% sure, but we're pretty close. The reason that we have variation of skin pigmentation is as humans began to leave, let's say, East Africa, which is where all humans have their source of origination, they began to confront different physical environments. And in the case of skin pigmentation, basically, as humans began to enter cloudier environments where the sun didn't shine, or as they went farther and farther away from the equator, what that meant is the solar angle was getting lower and lower. If you've got darkly pigmented skin in one of those locations where there really isn't that much sunshine, you're not going to get enough vitamin D. So there would have been an environmental adaptation to have lighter skin so that you could absorb more vitamin D. And that would mean the survival of the species in that particular unique physical environment. The opposite is true near the equator. Near the equator, where the solar angle is high, you might need more darkly pigmented skin as a protection against skin cancer. And so it is thought with near 100% certainty that the variation in skin pigmentation basically is a product of distance from the equator. How much vitamin D coming from the sun would be available in terms of that particular geographic location. But again, that skin pigmentation represents just a really tiny change in the overall human genetic code. Let's move on to our discussion of ethnicity. You'll see that there are some similarities, but there are also some unique differences. Let's start out with some of the differences. First, with regard to ethnicity, there really isn't any genetic component. Rather, ethnicity has to do with identity. Identity with a particular cultural group. So, classic example, you might say, I am of, let's say, German ethnicity. You live in Germany, you speak German. And the people who live in France, they're a different ethnic group. The people who live in the other direction. In Poland, they're a different ethnic group. And it turns out there's probably almost no genetic difference between those different groups. They're all within broadly the North European group. But the reason they think of themselves as distinct people, as distinct ethnicities, has to do primarily with language. So the root of ethnicity is really differences in language. Now, the only similarity between ethnicity and race is that language, as we've already learned, unique languages come from a period of group isolation. And so, since the root of ethnicity is language, and since language comes from group isolation, the same thing can be said here in terms of what creates both ethnicity and race. They both come from an earlier period in human history, before globalization, before high-speed internet connections, mobility, and all the rest of it, when we were more isolated geographically and had very little contact with other people. So that's the common thread, at least scientifically, that unites these two concepts. What we're going to do now is we're going to move on to this idea that race really isn't real. It's not biological or even genetic per se, but really what it amounts to is a socially constructed phenomenon. The way I want to do this is I want to make the argument that any attempt to divide humans into distinct and discrete races are generally a reflection of culture and not a reflection of genetic or biological fact. And then, of course, the conclusion of that argument is that race is primarily a socially constructed phenomenon. There are 4 pieces of evidence that I will start with here. There's a 5th one, but we'll get to that later. And I'm actually going to start with just 2. The first 2 are here. The first is something called the pencil test. Why don't we start out with that one? I need to take you back in time to the American state of Louisiana. Way back in time to before Louisiana became a state. So let's say 1810, 1790, something like that. At that time in Louisiana's history, there was a really large percent of the population that was technically of mixed racial heritage, basically biracial. African American and white, Native American and Spanish, whatever it might be. So lots of people in Louisiana were technically biracial. But when Louisiana became a state, an American state, officially in 1820, they basically came into a part of the United States that we call the South, a part of the United States that had a strong tradition of racial segregation of public accommodations, schools, what have you. And so Louisiana was suddenly confronted with a problem. How are we going to implement racially segregated schools when we've got something like 1/3 of the population that is technically biracial? What will we do with the biracial people? Will they go to the white school? Will they go to the black school? And what they decided to do is kind of, in a way, ridiculous. They implemented something called the pencil test, and it ran something like this. You would literally drop a pencil through a student's hair. If the pencil fell to the floor because of finely textured hair, you went to the school that was designated for the white students. And if the pencil didn't fall through because of maybe kinkier textured hair, you went to the school for African American students. And so what they did is they had a messy reality on the ground, and they tried to impose their views of race on top of that messy reality. And that's what this does. It provides a nice example of how race is really a reflection of our views and our minds, our culture, and not really a reflection of the biological reality. Because students who were technically biracial, even triracial, suddenly found that they had to go into one of these boxes, white versus black. Now, there's another piece of evidence that I'd like to talk about, and that is this. The reality on the ground globally is that there is a continuum, or maybe a better way of putting it is a gradient of change with regard to phenotypical differences. So they don't change abruptly. They change very slowly and very subtly. And the result is it really doesn't make any sense at all to draw those lines on the map that we saw in the previous video. So the example that I have here is Germany to India. Let me explain. We could get on a bus in Germany and drive all the way to India. And I could ask students on this bus to take a look around at each one of our stops: Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Azerbaijan, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and finally India. And I could ask people, hey, what race were the people that you saw in the different towns that we stopped at in these different countries? And while it's true most of you would say, well, the Poles seemed white to me, and the Ukrainians did as well, and I suppose the Russians did as well, what you wouldn't notice is that, in fact, when you got to this line separating the white race, quote-unquote, from the Asian race, quote-unquote, there really wasn't a strongly demarcated racial border. In fact, a real subtle change occurred. Skin pigmentation subtly got darker, maybe eye shape changed, but subtly. So to impose these really stark lines separating humans into discrete racial groups makes no sense. It's a reflection of our need to divide, and not a reflection of biological or even phenotypical reality. Now, there are two other pieces of evidence that I want to give, and they're pretty simple to go through. One of them I've already mentioned. Because of how much we know now, because of the studying of the human genetic code, because of the unraveling of the human genome, we now know that those 5 official racial groups that our government uses are nonsense, because they now know, the scientists, that there's much more genetic variation within each racial group than between them. That startling fact has basically dismantled our entire understanding of race, and as a result, we should probably jettison those categories altogether. But we don't, because there's a lot of inertia associated with them. Finally, you might be asking yourself this question: why then do the 4 or maybe 5 racial categories seem so real to us? We all understand them as real. Well, at least partly it has to do with the human emphasis on visuality, which means we tend to emphasize that which we can see. It is our sight that is our most important sense. And so over the long term of human culture and human history, we tend to make a bigger deal about what we can see. Skin pigmentation is the first thing you notice, and as a result, it tends to be something that we elevate in importance. Now, I've got just one more piece of evidence that I want to provide for you to give you 5 altogether, and that is this. If race was real, if the categories that we used today were real, then technically they should have stayed the same over all of our history, but they haven't. The race categories that we have today and the ones that we've had in the past are not the same. So they're basically vaguely defined and also subject to change. So to prove this to you, I'm just going to give you a snapshot of 1 year in American history. It's 1820, and as you will see, 1820 is very different from the year 2000 or the year 2010. Where we have just those 5 categories. There were 7 categories in 1820. Some of them you will recognize: white and black. There was also, oddly, a category for just people of Chinese heritage that was separate from the Asian category. Indian/Native American, that makes sense, of course. But what on earth is quadroon and octoroon? It was our government's attempt at the time to make sense of biracial individuals. Quadroon meant you were, in this case, of mixed race, and you had 3 white grandparents and 1 African American. So you were basically 1/4 African American. And octoroon, of course, meant you were 1/8 African American. So why the fuss about the percent African American? It kind of had to do with the culture in America at the time, the so-called one-drop rule. It was about policing the borders of whiteness. And so these unique categories came and made their debut and have since fallen out of favor. And the fact that we had them as unique races means that our ideas about race are changing, they're fluid, they're dynamic, and therefore they can't really reflect biological reality. Primarily they reflect our culture.